Hi, Annabella.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show on meaningoflife.tv. You are Annabella Pitkin. You teach Buddhism at Lehigh University.
I do.
More specifically, you focus on Tibetan Buddhism, which we're going to talk about. You're writing a book about a 20th century Tibetan Buddhist saint. So thanks for taking an hour away from that project to talk to us. And we, as I said, I would like to focus on Tibetan Buddhism because, for one thing, it gets a certain amount of attention, partly because it's the Dalai Lama's tradition, and he's become, from the point of view of a lot of people, kind of like head Buddhist or something. Although, of course, Buddhism isn't structured that way, but he's kind of, I guess, easily the most famous Buddhist in the West these days. So I want to talk about what exactly Tibetan Buddhism means, given that many people who've encountered Buddhism as a practice in the United States and elsewhere in the West may have encountered a different tradition. They may do Zen, or they may do Vipassana, or in the more Theravadan tradition. So I would like to just, for one thing, flesh out what Tibetan Buddhism is in terms of meditative practice and philosophical doctrine and so on. But I wanted to start by asking whether, at a higher level of generalization, it's possible to say what Buddhism is. In other words, I think when people view a religion from afar, they're not part of it, they've heard about it, they kind of imagine that there's one answer to that question, that it's a homogeneous thing. And usually scholars, the more immersed in a religion they get, the more they realize, how variegated it is. But that's not to say there's no generalizations you can make about the whole thing. So I'm wondering how you answer the question as a scholar of Buddhism. If somebody just says to you, can you, in a nutshell, tell me what Buddhism is?
That would be a pretty powerful nutshell, I must say.
It would be. I would be very impressed if you boiled it down that much.
And I don't know if I have the superpowers to fit all of Buddhism in a nutshell, though it sounds like the kind of task that the Mahayana saint meditators pose for themselves. But maybe we could say that there's a couple ways you could frame that question. One is to say, what types of questions do Buddhists ask? So what's a Buddhist question? A Buddhist question might be, what's the purpose of human life, and why do we experience it as unsatisfactory the way that we do? And so a Buddhist might be defined as someone who sees the answer to that question as lying in what Buddhists call taking refuge in the three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, which is the teaching of the Buddha, and the community of Buddhist practitioners. And so from a very early period, taking refuge, placing one's trust in those three things has been one kind of definition of what Buddhism is. You could also ask what Buddhists do. And of course, you could ask, like we do in the West, what Buddhists believe. And those all give quite different answers.
Right. You mean depending on the Buddhist, in the Buddhist tradition?
Yes, but also depending on the question. So, for example, one of the things that may turn out to be a theme in our conversation today is that a lot of our ability to talk about Buddhism and to talk about Tibetan Buddhism as distinctive is mediated for us through the lens of our intellectual ancestors, those writers in English and other European languages about Buddhism who were active at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And the big takeaway from that is they were in the middle of big colonial projects. And even when they weren't, they were very connected to them and committed to them. And so things that people were worried about 100 years ago, is Buddhism rational? Are Asian Buddhists good Buddhists? Or are Protestant Europeans better Buddhists because they have a textual Buddhism that's very rational and very ritual-free? Those kinds of questions sound like they come from the past, but they're actually really alive and well now. And so when we think about what is Buddhism, I think a lot of my students think that I'll tell them what Buddhists believe. But often in my classes, what we talk about is what different kinds of Buddhists do. And that difference shows us something about what types of baggage, what we might call Westerners, bring to the table, and what kinds of concerns people in other Buddhist communities bring to the table.
Now going back to something you said early on, you said that the questions Buddhists ask involve things like the purpose of life and why is life so unsatisfactory so often? And that second question, of course, is about the famous, it's usually, there's a word dukkha that is usually translated as suffering, although sometimes more as a kind of unsatisfactoriness or something. But the idea is that there's something kind of wrong with life as ordinarily lived, and this is the first of the Noble Truths and so on. And this is common to all Buddhist traditions, the idea of the Four Noble Truths. You said something else that I don't hear so often in connection with Buddhism, which is the word purpose. Mm-hmm. And maybe, in other words, what is the purpose of life? And maybe the reason I don't hear that so often is because I've encountered Buddhism in Western contexts. I don't know. But what is, you want to elaborate on that? I mean, what are some kinds of answers you get to, I can imagine how you might answer that question, but I haven't heard that answered so explicitly very much.
That's really interesting that you pick up on that, and that might be my Tibetan roots showing. So if I speak now from the perspective of Tibetan Buddhist communities, human life is very rare because we're thinking about a system of the universe that's open-ended. It has no beginning and no end, and there's an endless cycle of the reincarnation of consciousness in many forms, and that's a kind of standard thing that Buddhists in different communities across Asia share, and that's also part of a larger South and East Asian understanding of the relationship between consciousness and time and space, which we don't have to go into here. But the payoff from the Tibetan point of view is it is hard to be born as a human being, and it's actually very unlikely. So anybody right now who might be watching this interview who has the luxury of a human birth and a computer is super fortunate. And this type of good fortune doesn't come around very much, and so human life should be made meaningful. This is a kind of leitmotif of many, many Tibetan Buddhist teachings and texts. And how do you make it meaningful? Well, you make it meaningful in a Mahayana sense. And
we should say that Mahayana is one of the major. There's the basic branching of Buddhism is between Theravadan, which is largely in Southeast Asia, Mahayana, which is Chinese, and Tibetan is although distinct is generally classified as part of Mahayana, right?
Yes, if we want to do a quick kind of lightning history flash, we could say that when the Buddha, the historical Buddha Shakyamuni of our lifetime, who lived around 2,500 years ago and seems to have been a historical individual, during the time of the very earliest community, there don't seem to have been a lot of philosophical debates. People seem to have focused on other kinds of questions, like how do I achieve nirvana? And then, of course, as these things do, different philosophical views and different lineages of teachers developed. The magic kind of traditional numbers that there were 18 schools, and the only one of those 18 schools that survives is the Theravadan school, which is, as you said, in Southeast Asia. And which is famous for using texts in the Pali language, some of which are very, very old. And then somewhere around the turn of the first millennium, so around the year 100 or the year 200, we start to see hints in the literature of this new philosophical orientation that we call Mahayana, because they called themselves Mahayana, which means the big vehicle. So they said, we are the people who have the big vision of Buddhism, and our project isn't just nirvana, it's Buddhahood for ourselves and for everybody else. And the minute you have that, you begin to have this fantastic explosion of tons of different kinds of Buddhas, lots of different kinds of writings about how you become one of these different kinds of Buddhas. And that's the type of Buddhism that then spreads everywhere else in Asia. So it spreads all over India, spreads to China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and also to Tibet. And then from Tibet, it spreads in another flavor to Mongolia. And
it makes sense that it would spread because a distinctive emphasis of Mahayana is on spreading it, right?
Very much so. And then Buddhism in general. Buddhism is often not thought of as a religion that does mission work, but in fact, Buddhists have been missionaries of Buddhism since the earliest periods that we know about.
Okay, so I interrupted you when you were saying that that within the context of Mahayana, and I guess more specifically Tibetan, there's this emphasis on making life meaningful. Is that the way you put it?
Yes, it's very suitable with your the title of this.
Meaning of Life TV. This is what we're here for.
So from the Tibetan Mahayana point of view, so Tibetans are Mahayana Buddhists, and everything that we might talk about in a moment that might be distinctive or special about Tibetan Buddhism because of the way that it incorporates so much late Indian Buddhism within it. That's all within the Mahayana container. So the whole Tibetan Buddhist identity, self-conception, things that Tibetan Buddhists do, it's all organized around this Mahayana vision of the person called the Bodhisattva who wishes to become enlightened specifically from the compassionate impulse to assist others. So we have this in Zen, also we have this in all the Chinese Buddhist schools and Korean Buddhist schools. And then in the Tibetan context, one of the effects of that is, what does it mean to be human? Well, it means one should make one's life meaningful.
Okay, now let me interrupt you on the Bodhisattva point before we pursue meaning a little further. There I gather the idea is a Bodhisattva is someone who is kind of on the brink of full-fledged enlightenment, nirvana, and so on, and therefore has the option of spending his or her life in a state of pure bliss, not necessarily involving a whole lot of social interaction, I guess, because if you're enlightened, you know, you're not necessarily going to be the life of the party. But in any event, I gather that the Bodhisattva chooses, while on the brink of nirvana and having the option of immersion in nirvana, chooses to go around helping other people follow the Buddhist path, right? So this is part of the kind of, I mean, maybe missionary is too Western a word and is misleading, but this is where I guess Mahayana Buddhism gets some of it, the missionary energy. I mean, this is this a thing that has helped it spread? First of all, do I have it right? That's kind of what a bodhisattva is?
Yes, so technically, I mean, anybody could be a bodhisattva. You and I could take bodhisattva vows right now that we would work to benefit all living beings until...
Oh, I see. So we don't have to be super adept meditate. We don't have to demonstrate that we're close to nirvana.
No, and the word bodhisattva is very old. It goes all the way back to the earliest Buddhist communities that we know of. And in the very earliest literature, it just means the historical Buddha Shakyamuni before he became the Buddha. So while he was on the path toward Buddhahood, he was the bodhisattva. And in all the wonderful stories of his previous lives where he does great things as a rabbit and as a prince and as a little boy and as a little girl, all those wonderful deeds, he was the bodhisattva. So one of the innovations, or possibly you could say one of the logical developments, if you're a Mahayana exponent, that Mahayana Buddhism picks up on them is to say, well, if the historical Buddha did all these things as a bodhisattva, shouldn't we? Couldn't we? Maybe we could. And so then when we think about spreading of Buddhism, perhaps you're right, the word missionizing isn't so helpful because it has such strong connotations in English. In the Buddhist literature, we often find living a Buddhist life held up as the strongest kind of advertising for others to see. And so that's the way that Buddhists have described their project to themselves. We could also say that Buddhists were great traders, and that's another way that Buddhism spread.
Sure. And it was not the only religion that has spread that way. In a lot of Islamic trade in history and a certain amount of Christian trade.
Sure.
Okay, so there is the scenario that you hear about where the Bodhisattva has the option of full-fledged nirvana, but chooses to go around kind of spreading the word, so to speak. But that's not, I'm gathering, essential to the definition of a Bodhisattva. Now back to this business of, so is this how you make your life meaningful? I gather the purpose of an individual from the point of view of Mahayana Buddhism is to make his or her life meaningful. And I guess one of the ways you can make it meaningful is to live the life of a Bodhisattva and go around, kind of teaching and helping people follow the path. Is that the main way, or are there various ways you can give your life meaning, or what?
From the Mahayana Buddhist point of view, that is the main way. So one of the kind of caveats that's placed, it's so wonderful, it sounds so great, we have this fantastic human life, it's so great, you won the lottery, you must have been a great saint in your past life to have this marvelous human rebirth. So that's very nice. But then the other sort of sentence that goes with it from the Mahayana point of view is, we all know that human life is very brief and the end of it is very unpredictable. So in that setting, you want to use your time very efficiently. And the literature from the Tibetan world is very aware of the fact that for most people, they may take bodhisattva vows and they may make a lot of aspirations, but most people are not going to do really heroic levels of meditation practice in their ordinary lives. They have to make a living, they have kids, they have, you know, flocks to tend, all of these things.
I'm familiar with the problem, except for the flocks, yes.
We all have our flocks. They may be of different, some of them may be of different
magnitude.
Different magnitude. So in that setting then, for a regular person, for a kind of regular Joe, making life meaningful might just mean doing as many good deeds as you can and not doing bad stuff. And then kind of stockpiling your positive momentum so that eventually those bodhisattva vows will really have some traction.
Okay. So, on to the, and it sounds like maybe this emphasis on purpose. Well, yeah, this is, what you said is definitely to some extent distinctive of Mahayana, I guess, and therefore Tibetan Buddhism. Now, within Mahayana, though, Tibetan Buddhism is somewhat distinctive, I take it. And I'm curious, by the way, do you practice? Are you a practicing meditator, or have you practiced?
You know, that's such a tricky question for an American academic, because there's a very interesting kind of separation of practice and scholarship. But I'll be totally forthright with you and the audience of the interest and say, yes, indeed, I have indeed practiced. And it's very interesting to have that experience, because one of the things that my students often bring to the table is an assumption that meditation will, number one, be really easy, and secondly, that it will really quickly have some kind of therapeutic effect, which is maybe some clue about the way we're talking about Buddhism these days in this country. And in fact, of course, it turns out the meditation, simple breath meditations, is one of the simplest things in the world, and also very hard. It's very interesting.
Yes, very, very hard. And if someone wants to find out how hard, I recommend they sit down and close their eyes and try to focus on 20 consecutive breaths and really stay focused and not and see whether their mind wanders at some point, like, for example, after the first breath in my case.
Yes, indeed.
So it is hard, and you are familiar with it. What, I guess, before we get into doctrine, what would you say is distinctive about Tibetan meditation as opposed to other forms? And I think in America, the main forms in which people encounter meditative instruction would be, first of all, Zen. I think maybe that was the first one to make a big splash over the last 50 years. I think of that as being kind of a West Coast thing, San Francisco Zen Center in
Right.
60s and the 70s. I think a lot of people do Vipassana meditation, which is in the more associated with the Theravadan tradition. Vipassana means insight meditation. So some of these big or well-known among American Buddhists retreat centers, such as the Insight Meditation Society, its kind of sister site, Spirit Rock in Marin County in California. Those are in the Vipassana tradition. But then there's also Tibetan. And as I said, gets a lot of publicity. There are a number of kind of celebrity adherents, and there's the Dalai Lama. What would you, if you were forced to generalize about these three traditions, or forced to say something about what's characteristic of Tibetan meditation, what would you say?
The first thing I would say, honestly, is that they are not very different. That they may appear to be different in some kind of ritual senses. For example, the color schemes may be quite different, right? You might notice that in a Zen center, things are kind of bare wood and black and gray. You might notice that in a Tibetan center, the cushions might be red and there might be more colors in the artwork. So those kind of things will often give a different sort of cultural flavor. And obviously the languages that people might chant or recite or read in might be different, although they might all be using English. But from another point of view, let me suggest that when Buddhists talk about meditation, they tend to talk about very consistent forms of meditative practice, most of which they trace in very similar kinds of ways back to the historical Buddhists. So for all Buddhist communities, what makes your practice legitimate? Oh, it's because my teacher got it from his or her teacher who got it from back, all the way to the historical Buddha. And so of those forms of meditation, the big three are the two that you mentioned and one more, the following the breath meditation. So that's sort of technically called shamatha calm, abiding meditation. And it's very important in Theravada monastic communities and meditative communities. And it's also very important in Tibetan communities. And it's very important for Zen practitioners. And it's often the first thing people are suggested to do. So just following the breath and developing some mental stability. And it's sort of, if your mind is like a muscle, if you use the analogy of a muscle, then you want to be able to train that muscle to rest on an object. And when you do that, then there are many benefits that are described, like peacefulness and blissfulness. And then that's one piece of what's possible. And then the other big strand of meditative practice that, again, is really widely shared is the Vipassana strand, so this insight meditation, which is called Lakdong, special insight in Tibetan, is also important for Zen, right? So the idea that you will develop a analytical and then ultimately a direct personal experiential insight into the nature of reality and the nature of your own mind, which we can talk about what emptiness is, but which is in part an insight into the fact that phenomena exist in a connected and interdependent way, but not in a separate, private way. That insight, the cultivation of that insight, is also crucial among all these traditions. And then the last one, and this is one that Tibetans emphasize a great deal, which Zen practitioners and maybe Theravada practitioners might also emphasize, but in slightly different language, is loving kindness. So why do we practice these forms of meditation? Well, partly it's about our relationship with this universe that we're interdependently connected to, and loving kindness is at the core of that. So for Theravadins, it's called metta, loving kindness meditation, and in Tibetan traditions, it's often talked about as mind training.
Now, does an emphasis on that go back a very long way in Asia? Now, I know it goes back. In other words, you can find references to it for going many centuries back. But I had read somewhere that at least within Theravadan Buddhism, metta is much more emphasized at kind of Western retreat centers than it might be in, say, Thailand or Sri Lanka or something.
That's a really good question. I think, so much of the institutional history of Buddhism everywhere that it's ever been established is so tied to other kinds of cultural and political changes. And certainly the winds of fashion blow, through religious institutions too. So that's a very interesting question. Are people like Sharon Salzberg teaching metta, much more directly now? That I don't know. Certainly in the Tibetan context, the emphasis on loving kindness is there from the earliest transmission of Buddhism into Tibet from India. And it's one of the things that Tibetans argue is present in the Indian tradition that they inherited also from a very early period. So from the Tibetan point of view, if you think of Buddhahood as being like a kind of bird, then you need two wings to fly, and one of them is wisdom, which this Vipassana insight Lakdong produces, and the other is the love and compassion. And without both wings, you can't fly to Buddhahood.
Mm-hmm. Now, the thing you referred to, the kind of experiential apprehension of the true nature of reality, as opposed to a philosophical articulation of the true nature of reality, which, as you said, is sometimes, especially more in the Mahayana tradition, I'd say, summed up with the word that's translated as emptiness. The idea of that you can experientially apprehend the true nature of reality, that's common to all of these, right? I just want to be clear on that. I mean, that seems to me, and then there is different emphasis among them. So in Theravadan, you're more likely to hear about the not self experience and the not self doctrine, and that's something that I think is recognized in the others. But the others, like Mahayana, I guess might put. I mean, you tell me. There's more emphasis on emptiness, and I guess in Mahayana is not self sometimes subsumed in emptiness. In other words, the idea is of emptiness, without getting into it too much, is that kind of nothing has self in the sense that, when you perceive this lamp normally, you're kind of attributing a kind of essence of lamp to it. Mm-hmm. But the idea of emptiness is that's a misapprehension. Nothing has essence. Nothing has self-sufficient, independent existence, independent of its relationship with other things. And then that includes your own self. So you can see emptiness as the doctrine that nothing has essence, including you.
Right. Exactly.
but in Theravada, it's more often kind of not self is kind of emphasized more, I think, as applying to you, and the key essential experience is the experience that yourself, in some sense, does not exist as an independent, autonomous thing. Does this?
Right, exactly. And so one of the things we could say is that some of the earliest Buddhist literature talks about trying to experientially know that this self that we think we have is not the self that we think we have, and that this is actually the key to Buddhist liberation. This is somehow the profound insight that all meditative projects from a Buddhist point of view are oriented towards. And then as other Buddhist schools develop over time, they all have different interpretations of emptiness. Within Mahayana, there are lots of different flavors, philosophically speaking. And in Tibet, one of the most important Indian thinkers is an individual called Nagarjuna, who is a really exciting thinker to read because he says radical things like there is no intrinsic identity in any of the phenomena, including in the institutions of Buddhism, which is a really challenging thing. So that's a very exciting philosophical set of possibilities. And from the point of view of Tibetan Buddhist philosophers and meditators, that's something that we can approach through our analytic tools, through our human intelligence. For example, Tibetan Buddhism is famous for having schools that approach syllogistic logical philosophy through the practice of debate. And it's very colorful and exciting, and people, there's a lot of noise. It's kind of like soccer for your brain. And so debate is one way of using the intellect to zero in on exactly what we mean when we talk about emptiness and no self. And at the same time, of course, why would we want to do that? We would want to do that so that we would actually be able to know what that's like. So there are stories of people having meditative breakthroughs on the debate floor or immediately afterwards. And there are also people who are famous for having never debated or who have debated and then later gone off to meditate. And it's really meditation that pushes them to have that insight.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I think of when I think of Tibetan meditation is visualization. Like in Vipassana, at least as it's taught in the United States, I don't think, and I've been to a number of retreats, I don't think I've ever heard a teacher say,
right,
except for the case of metta meditation, loving kindness meditation, where you're kind of imagining a person you'd like to think of lovingly. Mm-hmm. But in kind of garden variety Vipassana meditation, I've never heard anyone say, imagine this image. And it's much more about just, once you've stabilized your mind by focusing on your breath, it's much more about observing kind of the contents of your mind, so to speak, in a way that leads to insight. But it's true, right, that Tibetan, and I think not just more than Vipassana, but more than Zen, involves the imagining, the instructions involve imagining specific images, sometimes exotic images, right?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question to ask, because when we think about Tibetan Buddhism as Mahayana Buddhism, as one form of Mahayana Buddhism, of course, then everybody's question is going to be, yes, but why does it look so different? Why are there such different kinds of images? Why is there visualization? What is that? And so the answer is that Tibetan Buddhism is also overwhelmingly Vajrayana Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism. So Vajrayana, if Mahayana means the big vehicle, the excitingly big vehicle, as it says about itself, then Vajrayana would be the diamond vehicle, the indestructibly pure vehicle. And so Tantra is often misunderstood and kind of caricatured in the West as being about, celebrities having fabulous erotic adventures or some sort
my first encounter with the word was in college when some guy said he had been studying, tantric Buddhism, and so was now great in bed. That was the first thing I heard, and that's and I assume there is this aspect of it somewhere in the literature, right? That this is one way the discipline it gives you can be applied, but it's just not the main thing. Is that right?
Well, not exactly, but in the great high civilization of the kind of Indian world, of the Indic South Asian world, in the Middle Ages, the aims of human life included religious liberation and intellectual achievement, but also they included things like the perfection of pleasure and the perfection of wealth. And so there are instruction manuals. The most famous is the Kama Sutra, which tell you how to perfect the pleasure aspect. There are other manuals that tell you how to get really rich, right? So the practices that we think of as tantra develop in a world in which cultivated people potentially may be cultivating themselves in all kinds of ways. But tantra particularly is a set of what we could call yogic practices for harnessing the psychophysical elements of the body for various purposes of the meditator. And for Buddhists, so this is a real key thing, the for Buddhists part, but for Buddhists, and particularly for Tibetan Buddhists, the only reason that that would be interesting is if you could become a Buddha faster by using these special yogic techniques. So for Buddhists, Tantra has nothing to do with sex. It harnesses the same psychophysical pathways that ordinary human sexuality uses, but that's just because those are the powerful pathways through which energy moves through the body according to this traditional system of medicine.
So what's an example of how you would use tantric practice then? I mean, is this associated with the chakras and like attaining states of tremendous bliss and controlling the flow of the blissful energy up and down your spine and that type of thing?
Yes, you've read lots of good books, I can tell. Yes, indeed. Well, one of the ways to think about it is that Vajrayana Buddhism, or Tantra, so the Buddhism of the Tibetan Buddhist world in Mongolia, and to some extent, these ideas also travel to China and to Japan. They traveled to Southeast Asia, but they didn't sort of take off as much there. So some of the interesting historical questions are, why did some countries go for this and some didn't? But in the Tibetan context, what Tantra and Vajrayana practice really mean are taking the result of the path as the path. So the result of the path for a Mahayana practitioner is Buddhahood. And what Vajrayana does is it says, okay, future you, future Bob, is going to be Buddha Bob. And what would happen if you used your amazing human power of imagination to imagine being Buddha Bob now? You might eventually bring your body, speech, and mind of ordinary Bob into total harmony with the Buddha Bob that is future you. And if you could do that, boy, that'd be pretty powerful stuff. So the promise of Vajrayana is that it takes the bodhisattva motivation, I want to get enlightened and become a Buddha to save everybody from suffering, and it lights a fire under it. And it says, if I really love everybody, and also if they've all been my beloved mom through lifetime after lifetime, because we've all been here forever, then I want to hurry really fast. And if I want to hurry, what is the technology that will allow me to change myself into future me, future Buddha me really quickly? It's the practices of Vajrayana. So that is a kind of really quick and dirty rationale for what it is.
Okay, but you've just alluded to my imagining kind of the future Bob who has improved, so to speak, through meditation and gotten closer to Buddhahood, which incidentally sounds kind of like some self-help instructions in totally secular realms. But in any event, what I've heard about visualization in Tibetan meditation is stuff like visualize a golden tree and and that kind of stuff. So is it really that a substantial part of the visualization is kind of about, in some sense, visualizing the future better you?
It is, but in a very particular technical way. So first of all, one should point out that the actual meditative practice of visualizing changes in oneself is understood by the Tibetan tradition to be really advanced. And you wouldn't want to try it. You wouldn't want to even kind of go there too much if you didn't have a couple things as the baseline container. So the first baseline is you would need to have really perfect ethical practice. Maybe you would be a monk or a nun, or maybe you'd be a really committed and strong lay practitioner, because the obvious downside of this is megalomania, right? Mm-hmm. You could become a total nutter in thinking that you are, future me. So you would want to have a really strong ethical basis, and that's a standard Buddhist commitment in any case, that the first step of all Buddhist practice is perfect ethical behavior.
Okay, so I will work on the ethical perfection thing. What is the second thing I need to attain before I can start imagining the future Bob?
Then the second thing is this idea of emptiness, in fact. Because as long as, and we all harbor this sense that I exist in a permanent, concrete, unchanging, private, separate way, everybody has that sense of self. So as long as we have that sense of self, there's no room for any imaginal process to work. There's no room for any transformation. In fact, one of the interesting ways philosophically to think about emptiness is to think that it is not nothingness, right? It's not nihilism. It's actually a theory of transformation. So one of the ways to think about Tantra or about Vajrayana is that it is a practice of transformation. And in fact, for most meditators, they wouldn't start off imagining themselves as a Buddha. They might imagine that the Buddha was in front of them, showering them with blessings. But they're developing the faculty of imagination, and they're beginning to think about the possibility that the ordinary reality they live in is not separate from the pure enlightened reality of the Buddha realm. And it's that leap that emptiness actually makes possible, and loving kindness motivates it.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. It sounds like maybe there's hope for me yet to attain Buddhahood now that I've gotten the actual instruction. I had made frustratingly little progress through the Vipassana route. Maybe this is a conversion experience, and I'll call myself a Tibetan from now on. Or Tibetan Buddhist or something. So what about? Have you heard this little kind of, I guess, joke that Tibetan meditation is for artists, Zen is for poets, and Vipassana is for psychologists?
Oh, that's hilarious! I've never heard that. That's fantastic.
It kind of makes sense. I mean, I guess with Zen, the references to, for one thing, koans. The kind of poetry of the koan, which in some Zen traditions is used. In Tibetan, I guess it has to do with maybe both the visualization and what you alluded to, which is that there's a little more color in display surrounding Tibetan Buddhism. And then with Vipassana, it makes sense that you think of psychology, because there's a lot about observing the dynamics of the mind, right?
Mm-hmm. You could certainly break it down that way. And I think in the West, and specifically in North America, that's actually a really handy picture of three of the groups in North America that have been really drawn to Buddhism. And those are certainly the big three flavors that people have liked here. And that might describe how people have gravitated to them here. Certainly in the Tibetan world and in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, poets and poetry are a huge factor. And the idea that Enlightenment experiences produce spontaneous overflowings of verse and song. This is a really major theme, as is the theme of the sort of visual arts. But then also, psychology is an interesting strand. One of the things that people often say to me in the United States that interests them about Tibetan Buddhism is that there's such a meticulous analysis of states of consciousness, mm-hmm. and also states connected to birth and the dying process. So a kind of theory of the mind is something that a lot of people like Richard Davidson and others are kind of looking into.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've mentioned the West again and again and again. And I think there's certainly an awareness that the Buddhism we encounter here in the United States, at least in the form of these retreat centers, as opposed to, say, maybe a Buddhist temple that you might find in California that Asian immigrants go to, But if you focus on these kind of retreat centers that people like me might go to, I think there's an understanding that, okay, this is unlikely to be exactly the kind of Buddhism you would be likely to encounter in Asia. Inevitably, there's been some Western influence. The teachers at these places are teaching to a Western audience with particular needs associated with this particular point in time, and so on. But it's also true, and you alluded to this a little earlier, and you also get into it in a book review you wrote recently. The book was called, well, you would know, but it's about something about the modernization of, what's in, do you know the review?
Buddhism in the Modern World.
Buddhism in the Modern World.
Right.
It's also true that the West started exerting influence on Buddhism long before Buddhism came to the West, because the West showed up in Asia in the form of imperialism and colonialization and so on, right? And so to some extent, in a way, the Buddhism that some of us encounter in the West has been kind of doubly influenced by the West. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, one of the interesting things for all of us at this interesting historical moment to think about is we have to use some kind of categories or we can't talk, right? So we talk about Westerners and Asians, and we talk about transnational flows coming from Asia to North America. But the truth is, as you've just said, Europeans went off on these colonial adventures and they had cultural encounters that confused them and that they tried to make sense of. They had a heavy footprint, and people in societies like in Sri Lanka, where the British set up a colonial outpost, had to respond, and that had effects, for example, on Sri Lankan Buddhism. Something similar happened in the Tibetan case under slightly different circumstances. So it's very hard to say that the arrows flow in one direction. Maybe we should say that there have been flows in several directions for at least 150 years and maybe more like 200 years, although we're only just beginning to see how that works.
Mm-hmm. And I gather that in some cases, and in particular in Sri Lanka, you started to see, early on, well before Buddhism kind of came to America, I don't want to say secularization of Buddhism, but relatively less emphasis on some of the supernatural elements, in part because they were being belittled and ridiculed by the Western occupiers, right? And so, and I guess relatively more emphasis on, in some cases, I think, on meditative practice and its relationship to Buddhist philosophy, because that kind of thing, the West. The Westerners could kind of, I think, buy into in a certain, or more easily, because it wasn't at odds with their Christian faith, and they didn't see it as a rival to the Christian faith, or for whatever reason. I gather that that in that sense, what we now think of as a Westernized Buddhism, which is, one with less emphasis on the supernatural, more emphasis on the meditative practice, is it fair to say that actually begins in Asia under Western influence?
Sure, we could say in dialogue with Western influence too. That I think, in some ways there's a kind of moving pair of opposites that come up when we talk about Buddhism. So is Buddhism the kind of perfect rational religion that's wonderfully compatible with natural science as practiced mostly in the West in the 19th century? And is Buddhism kind of the ideal maybe Protestant tradition because it's ritual free? So we have people making moves like that, and we have Europeans making moves like that, and then going on to claim that Asian Buddhists are doing it wrong, actually, and that it's European scholars who are better at Buddhism. And we have Asian nationalists in many different societies saying that Buddhism will only serve the nation if it has been purged of elements that they think may be hold it back in some way, that don't fit the nationalist project. And then we also have the opposite move. We have people in both the West and in Asian societies saying, actually, what we want is authenticity from our Buddhism. We love the ritual elements. We love the amulets and the protective spells because that's the old school authentic stuff. And all of those things are ways of talking and people kind of making use of the tradition for their own purposes. So when we talk here in North America, I think there's lots of different ways people come to Buddhism, and many of our labels tend to break down. So some people, Jan Willis, for example, has written in really interesting ways about racism in North American Buddhist communities, against people of color, against Asian immigrant Buddhists, kind of separations between different groups of Buddhists, and ways in which Buddhist communities are relatively segregated from each other, even if they share buildings, for example. And on the other hand, I think she and a number of other scholars have been pointing out lately that some of that is breaking down. You have second and third generation converts, and you have second and third generation immigrant Buddhists, and it's not at all clear how we should classify them, how they classify themselves, how we should all be talking about this.
Right, that's interesting. And certainly when I did my little oversimplified characterization of what I called Western Buddhism, thinking of it as a spiritual practice that is relatively consistent with modern science, doesn't involve many supernatural elements. I am, to some extent, just reading my own interest into it. But I will say, I think that reading has kind of been abetted by the Dalai Lama. I mean, right? I mean, he's really been big on the on saying, look, if anything's not compatible with science, we'll drop it, and so on. And of course, he's got a complex mission. On the one hand, he's a representative of Tibet and doesn't like the fact that it's it's under Chinese occupation. But he's also a spokesperson for Buddhism, and I don't know how those two wind up affecting each other. But for whatever reason, he has really emphasized the science part to an extent that I think a lot of Americans might be shocked if they went to Tibet and saw the way Tibetan Buddhism, can be practiced in ways that involve a lot of seemingly supernatural things. Right? What would you say about the way he has shaped the perception of Buddhism in the West?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think, His Holiness Dalai Lama has been, as far as I know, very interested himself in science since a very young age. And so many questions that scientists explore are ones that genuinely interest him. I don't think there's any kind of pretense about that. I think in some ways, if he had been born in Milwaukee, he might have grown up to be a physicist or something. So there's that piece. It's certainly true that in the Western inflected global society that we live in, science is power. And so a tradition that speaks the language of science is a tradition that can hold its own on the world stage and that can be taken seriously. I think questions like the one you asked are really interesting ones. In fact, they're the ones that I'm writing about right now. Huh. And I think one of the questions for me is, why are people from the North American side so weirded out by ritual? Why is it that we find ritual and incense and certain kinds of clothes and prostrations and pilgrimage, why is that weird? And why would that of itself be somehow not compatible with science?
That's a good question. I mean, speaking only for myself, I can say I was brought up Southern Baptist, and I think in some Protestant traditions, there's a certain skepticism of very elaborate ritual. Mm-hmm. I mean, the way I used to hear Catholicism belittled when I was young was, it's just all about it's just all about ritual for them, But so there may be a little of that. I mean, you earlier used the word Protestant to characterize, by way of analogy, a certain strand of Buddhism. But I think. I don't know. Well, you've asked a good question. I don't know the answer to that. And I think you're getting a lot of different kinds of practice in the West, as you suggested. Some people are very drawn to the, I noticed at retreat centers, some people like to bow to the Buddha before they take their seat. Now, I don't. I don't know. I'm sorry. But, it's, I'm sure you've noticed this variation in America about the attitude toward ritual. It's certainly not uniformly dismissive, right?
No, I think you're right. I think it's not at all uniformly dismissive. Some people are very happy to just try the whole thing on, right? Whatever they think the thing is. Some people have the kind of opposite trip, right? They think that the more different from the practices they grew up with something is, the more authentic and therefore effective and powerful it will be. And I think some people have very strong concerns about ritual, which may be rooted in Protestant Catholic anxieties and tensions, right? That's certainly an old theme in the study of Buddhism that goes back at least 150 years. I think there are some interesting dynamics going on, too, in conversations in the U.S. about what we mean by secularism and what we mean by religion. And so people are staking out different positions with respect to those two words. But one of the things that I have found very fruitful myself is to try to use a little bit of shock tactics, not quite as Zen koan, but a sort of shock tactics to explode that question by thinking, what if we took a category that seems particularly unpalatable from the scientific point of view, like a display of yogic ability, and we said, this is actually highly rationalized and highly rational, susceptible of rational analysis, not something that makes a claim of suspending your intelligence so that you can believe it, but that actually invites the use of your intelligence. So I'm not necessarily saying that I'll persuade you of that today, but I would say that there are Tibetan scholars who can talk that way. blending categories that we think of as scientific in North America, like rationality and logical causation and observation of the natural world, with claims about remarkable happenings as a result of faith and yogic practice. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting to me. Something's happening there when you can put those two ways of talking together and not see them as in conflict. That's something I think is worth pursuing.
Mm-hmm. You know, and I just had another thought on the resistance to ritual front. The other thing, I mean, we had rituals in the Southern Baptist Church. We bowed our heads when we prayed. We took communion. But the rituals were associated with kind of theological belief. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe part of my attitude toward Buddhism is I know when I go in, and there's the statue of the Buddha there in a retreat center, that traditionally in Asia, the bowing to the Buddha was associated with a set of beliefs, metaphysical / theological, whatever you want to call them, that I don't share. Mm-hmm. You know, So that's part of it, right? It almost seems to me like it would be disrespectful to the tradition of Buddhism and to Asian Buddhists for me to bow at that point.
That's very interesting. And I do think that not enough people are cautious in that way. You know, it's very exciting to kind of hurtle yourself into some sort of religious activity. And I do think it's a very interesting question to ask, you know, what is my intention? What are the intentions associated with this gesture? That's not a small quibble. Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned your book. Before we close the conversation, you want to say anything about the book you're working on? It sounds like you got a title, which is a good thing. It's titled. Am I right that it's called Beggar Modern?
Mm-hmm, it is indeed.
You're going to have to explain that. The subtitle is Modernity, Renunciation, and Love in the Life of a 20th Century Tibetan Buddhist Saint. But what does Beggar Modern mean?
Beggar Modern comes from a fantastic image by a really interesting scholar named Dipesh Chakrabarty, who writes about politics and literature and religion in many contexts. And he talks about how the term and the visual image of the Buddhist monk, the bhikshu in Sanskrit, is very closely cognate to the word for beggar, and that something very powerful is happening in the social and cultural imagination when the figure of the ragged wanderer with nothing, who is the kind of lowest outcast, sort of the person that politics and religious life and family life has kind of forgotten about, when that figure becomes a figure of peace and fulfillment and possibility and power, something very profound has occurred. So that was a very interesting metaphor for me to follow, and it got me thinking about the strong Buddhist rhetoric on renunciation, particularly because for scholars of Buddhism, everybody knows now in the kind of Buddhist studies world that Buddhists were talking to their families and hanging out with their families and dedicating the good karma from their religious activities to their families from the earliest records that we have evidence about. And so the image that being a Buddhist practitioner should mean, or has at one time meant for lots of people, kind of cutting all your ties, that doesn't seem to be quite true. But talking in a really intense way about cutting all your attachments, that has been very important. So I got really interested in what's the relationship between the rhetoric of renunciation and this bodhisattva practice of love. And how does that play out at the time when the societies of South and East Asia and the Himalayan world are undergoing massive change in the 20th century? So the kind of modern period. What happens with renunciation and love when everything is turned upside down? And I happen to be very lucky, and there's a really interesting figure named Kunu Lama Tenzin Gyaltsen, who is a teacher of the current Dalai Lamas, and his life really just poses all those questions for us, opens them right up.
Well, if I just heard those two words and was asked what the relationship might be between them, I would say, if you talk about actual renunciation, not merely rhetorical renunciation, I would think, renunciation of sensual pleasure, worldly possessions, and so on. I would think that might actually facilitate love in the kind of ideal Buddhist, and for that matter, the ideal Christian sense of the term, of a kind of diffuse love of everyone, as opposed to the more usual kind of, you might say, opportunistic or self-serving love. In other words, romantic love and love of kin and so on. I mean, there is a kind of a natural connection there that freeing yourself of the normal sensual kind of self-serving paths in life might liberate you to love more broadly, right?
Yes, absolutely. So that part makes, I think, a lot of sense, right? When we say love, ordinary people say love, what we really mean is how are they going to make me feel, right? What are they going to do for me?
Right.
Not I want them to be happy no matter what happens to me. So that's very kind of powerful link between renunciation and love. Where it gets sort of interesting and kind of quirky to think about is, what about if your renunciation is so thoroughgoing that you let go of things like fame, and eventually you let go of things like having students? Does that mean people can't find you and get the benefit of your teachings? Or is that actually a type of performance in which you are showing the students through the way that you live what it would mean to be not attached? So as you can probably tell, I lean to the side of seeing it as a kind of teaching performance. And I see it as, in fact, not an iron gate that keeps students out, but a kind of a little hook that leads at least some students deeper forward. But it's an interesting question to think about, what kind of bodhisattva is the bodhisattva who's very hard to find and very hard to know?
Yeah, one could take what you said and become a little cynical about bodhisattvas, right? I mean, it depends. I don't think you mean to say they're just showing off, but
no, not at all. I should be clear. I'm using the word perform in a kind of technical sense, that it's a display for the purpose of teaching others. Right. So in other words, we don't usually think about renunciation as a teaching tool, but in fact, it's a way of manifesting a lifestyle that might be itself a hook for other people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, listen, thank you. We've kind of run out of time. I wish we hadn't, because this is really interesting. But I appreciate your taking the time. Now you have to get back to finishing your book so we can read it.
Yes, indeed.
And maybe down the road we'll talk again when you've done enough more work on your book to warrant another break.
That would be great. You're nice to imagine me chained to the computer, and it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, well, same here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.